She whispered, "I swear I'll never do it again." I only stole the medicine from my mom. Rain fell in perfect vertical lines over Airless Spire, soft as needles of glass, each drop catching the city's cold light before sliding away into the drainage veins beneath the transparent walkways. The air was filtered and scentless, scrubbed clean of anything human, leaving behind only the faint hum of vents and the whisper of water striking polished metal. Ethan Cade sat alone on a bench outside the clinic kiosk, elbows on his knees, a cup of cheap furrow-and-seed coffee cooling between his scarred palms. He'd been there for an hour, staring at the recruitment terminal across from him, the blinking prompt waiting for a thumbprint he hadn't yet given. A temp contract, 12-hour shifts in symptom trials, low pay, no benefits. Still, it was something. But he couldn't bring himself to press his hand down. The last time he'd worn a clinic badge, people had died anyway. His reflection in the glass panel looked older than the 38 years behind it creased jacket. Dull eyes, a man who'd spent too long patching holes in other people's lives. He took a slow sip, bitter, burnt, and empty. That was when he saw her. She stood by the automated pharmacy rack, so small she barely reached the scanner plate. Her skin was a pale, luminous blue, hair tangled and dripping with rain. The light above her flickered, tracing faint violet glimmers across her face. She was barefoot, her feet leaving tiny wet prints on the glass floor. Ethan frowned. Kids didn't wander up here, certainly not alien kids. The upper corridors were monitored, sterile, built for those with credentials and clean data histories. She had none of those things. She stood perfectly still, staring at the glowing list of medications on the dispenser screen, her small hands twitching against her sides, as if she was memorizing something, waiting for a gap in attention. Ethan's gut tightened. He'd seen that kind of stillness before refugees in triage lines, children waiting to grab supplies before the soldiers noticed. The clerk at the counter turned away, reaching into a crate, and the girl moved. One step forward, a flick of her wrist, and the vial disappeared into her sleeve. The dispenser beeped, a soft, synthetic tone that somehow filled the corridor like an alarm. The attendant turned, confused, scanning the racks. "Hey," he began, but a security officer standing nearby was already moving, his boots sharp against the floor. "You there. Step away from the machine." The girl froze. Her eyes darted toward the exit's 2 corridors. Both watched. Ethan felt his pulse tighten. Procedure would take over now. The officer would scan her tag. She wouldn't have one, and the system would process her as property, an unregistered organism, destined for holding. He didn't think. He set his cup down, rose, and crossed the floor in 3 strides. "Easy," he said, his voice low, even. "She's scared, not dangerous." The officer hesitated, thrown off by his tone. "Sir, step back. This isn't your concern." Ethan ignored him. "It is now." The girl looked up at him then, her eyes a deep, uncertain violet, trembling between terror and defiance. She didn't speak. The vial slipped from her sleeve and rolled across the floor, stopping against his boot. He crouched slowly, picked it up, and turned it over in his hand. The label read Cordyline. His training stirred instinctively broad-spectrum human antibiotic, wrong strain, wrong biology. He looked at the girl. "Who's it for?" he asked softly. She swallowed hard. "My mom." Her voice cracked, high and trembling. "She's sick. She can't breathe when it's cold." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What's her name?" "Mary," she whispered. The officer stepped forward again. "Sir, move aside. That item's stolen property." Ethan straightened, meeting his eyes. "Then charge me." The guard blinked. "What?" "Charge me," Ethan said, his tone flat but unyielding. "You don't need a report. You need this to go quietly. Bill it to my account." Something in his stance old authority, muscle memory from years, giving orders under fire made the man hesitate. After a beat, the officer muttered, "Fine, but you bring her back if there's trouble." "There won't be," Ethan said. He turned to the girl. "Come on." She hesitated, looking at the vial still in his hand. "It's not the right medicine," he said quietly. "It'll make her worse. I'll help." The words came before he could stop them. He didn't owe this child anything. He wasn't a doctor anymore, not in any official sense. But as she fell into step beside him, small and silent, her bare feet slapping softly on the glass, Ethan felt something old stir in his chest, an instinct, a promise, a refusal to let another person die on his watch. The rain outside the spire kept falling, a steady pulse of light against the windows, as he led the little thief into the shadows below the clean world that had already forgotten her. The corridors narrowed as they descended into the lower tiers of airless spire, where the gleaming glass and chrome gave way to steel plates streaked with condensation and rust. The rain outside filtered through vents in a fine mist, carrying a faint tang of salt and oil, the first real scent Ethan Cade had noticed all day. The girl walked a half-step ahead, her small shoulders hunched, her thin dress plastered to her skin. Every few meters she looked back as if to make sure he was still following, as though some part of her couldn't quite believe someone had chosen to. Ethan said nothing, his boots echoing against the slick metal floor. His mind cataloged everything automatically: ambient temperature, airflow, the fatigue in her steps, the pallor around her eyes. She'd been underfed for weeks. They passed a broken sign that once read Maintenance Access 12, its letters flickering blue-white in the dim light. Lee turned down a side tunnel, past rows of sealed vents and humming generator nodes. The air grew colder, thicker, the sound of the city above fading into a muted, constant drone. She stopped finally beside a cracked bulkhead door, half hidden behind a recycling unit. "Here," she whispered. Ethan had to crouch to see inside. The alcove was barely a room, a narrow hollow lit by the flicker of a dying heater coil. Against the wall lay a woman blue-skinned like the girl but older. Her complexion faded to a dull gray, lips tinged violet, hair damp and tangled across her cheek. She was wrapped in a torn sea-green shawl, clutching it as if it were the only thing keeping her together. When she opened her eyes, they were sharp despite the weakness in her limbs, fixed on Ethan with instinctive suspicion. "Who is he?" she rasped. Lee knelt beside her quickly. "He helped me, Mom. He knows medicine." Ethan dropped his bag, kneeling across from them. The air was heavy with damp and the faint metallic tang of coolant. He reached for the woman's wrist without thinking, feeling for a pulse, slow, shallow, irregular. Her fingers were ice cold. He peeled back the shawl slightly, noting the tremor in her chest, the way her breath caught halfway in each inhale. "How long has she been like this?" he asked. Lee's voice was a small, frightened rush. 2 weeks. I tried to keep her warm, but the heater broke." Ethan nodded grimly. Her blood oxygen was collapsing under thermal stress common in hybrid species with mixed respiration chemistry. Without warmth, the hemoglobin equivalent in her system couldn't carry enough oxygen to the brain. Not infection, hypoxia. The wrong drug would have shut her down completely. He pulled open his field kit, hands moving by memory. Saline, stim injectors, thermal regulator pad. The mother watched him through half-lidded eyes. "You're guessing," she said hoarsely. Ethan met her gaze. "No, I've seen this before: venous strain, cold sensitivity, loss of breath under pressure changes. I can stabilize you, but we need a steady heat source." She tried to sit up, failed. "You shouldn't be here. she whispered. "You'll get flagged for aiding hybrids." "I'm not on any registry," he said. "No one tracks ghosts." The answer seemed to pause her suspicion just enough. Ethan attached the regulator pad to her chest and activated it. A low hum filled the alcove, warmth radiating outward in slow pulses. Lee watched wide-eyed as the color began to creep faintly back into her mother's skin. "She need hydration," Ethan said, pulling a ration flask from his coat. He tilted it toward Mary. He could see now the name etched faintly on a pendant around her neck. Slowly, Mary took a sip, her breathing evening by small degrees. She glanced at him again, less suspicion now, more exhaustion. "Why help us?" He hesitated, his voice quiet. "Because someone should have before it got this bad." Lee pressed closer to her mother, whispering softly in their native tongue, something that sounded like a prayer. The heater's pulse steadied, filling the alcove with a faint golden light. Outside, water dripped rhythmically from the ceiling panels, echoing like a clock, ticking somewhere far away. Ethan leaned back against the cold wall, watching the rise and fall of Mary's chest. The soldier in him calculated oxygen levels. The medic measured heart rate, but the man tired, lonely, and human felt something else settle in his chest. Something that had been missing since the war. Purpose. He didn't know what this city would do to them tomorrow. Didn't know if the system would hunt them for the small crime committed that morning. But as Lee finally fell asleep beside her mother, her tiny hand gripping the edge of his jacket, Ethan knew only one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving tonight. Morning crept into the alcove in thin gray strands of filtered light, slipping through the vent grates, mixing with the steady hum of the heater that had barely kept through the night. Ethan Cade hadn't slept. Old instincts refused to let him. He sat cross-legged against the wall, head bowed, watching the faint rise and fall of Mary's breathing. Her skin had regained a soft lilac hue, the bluish pallor retreating under warmth, though each breath still carried a shallow tremor. Lee slept curled beside her mother, small fingers tangled in the edge of Ethan's jacket, as if afraid he'd vanish if she let go. Outside, the city's mechanical dawn rose shutters sliding open, drones gliding past the outer corridors, automated chimes announcing the start of work shifts. Airless Spire came alive without ever truly waking. It hummed and breathed like a machine that had forgotten why it existed. Ethan rubbed his face, exhaustion pressing behind his eyes, and stood to stretch the stiffness from his legs. He needed food, clean water, maybe an upgraded heat coil before the temperature drop again. But leaving meant stepping into a world that already wanted to erase people like these two. Mary stirred faintly, eyes fluttering open, scanning the dim space until they found him. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice rough. "You didn't have to." Ethan looked over his shoulder. "Didn't feel right leaving you half alive." She tried to sit up, wincing as her chest protested. He moved closer, steadying her by the shoulders. "Slowly," he said, tone slipping into the quiet authority of habit. "You're still weak. Your system's adjusting." She studied him through a veil of damp hair. "You talk like someone who used to give orders." "I used to keep people alive long enough to take them," he said dryly. "Combat medic, Federation Recon Corps. Retired, technically." Her brow furrowed. "Technically?" "I left before they could decide what that meant." Her lips curved faintly, a ghost of humor cutting through fatigue. "So now you save strangers in storm drains? Only the ones worth saving?" It came out softer than he meant, and for a moment the air between them thickened, heavy with something unsaid. Lee stirred, blinking up at them, then smiled sleepily. "Mom," he fixed the heater. Mary's hand brushed her daughter's hair. "Yes, sweetheart," he did. The girl turned her violet eyes toward Ethan. "Are you going to stay?" He hesitated, the question landing like a weight he wasn't ready to measure. For a little while, he said finally. Lee seemed satisfied, curling back against her mother. Ethan pulled a ration bar from his pack, split it into thirds, and handed each piece to them. Eat slow. Your stomachs won't thank you if you rush. Mary chewed carefully, watching him with that same quiet, analytical gaze. You're running from something? She said after a while. He met her eyes, unflinching. Everyone here is. She smiled faintly, but her expression softened. You could have walked away yesterday. Instead, you paid for stolen medicine and carried a dying alien through the ring. Why? He looked toward the vent light, its glow pale and sterile. Because I'm tired of watching people die, because someone else followed the rules. The answer silenced them both. For a long moment, only the rain tapping faintly against the panels filled the room. Mary leaned back, eyelids heavy. You sound like my husband, she whispered. He believed in fixing what's broken too. Ethan said nothing, but something in the way her voice cracked told him the man was gone. He adjusted the heater's output and checked her pulse again, steady now, stronger. When he finally allowed himself to breathe, he realized he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. The medic had become something dangerous again attached. Outside, the glass corridors gleamed with artificial daylight, but in this forgotten alcove beneath the spire's perfection, warmth flickered in defiance of the cold world above. Ethan didn't know what would happen when night came again, only that when it did, he'd still be here, watching over the woman and child who had already begun to pull him back into the one thing he'd tried hardest to forget, hope. By the second night, the heater's pulse had become the rhythm of their fragile world, its soft hum rising and falling like a heartbeat that kept all three of them tethered to life inside the cold skeleton of airless spire. Ethan Cade had turned the alcove into something resembling a shelter, a patched blanket stretched across the open pipe to block drafts, a scavenged power cell linked to his field kit to keep the heat coil stable, and two cracked ration cans stacked under the vent to serve as makeshift stools. It wasn't much, but it was more than the void they'd had before. Mary's strength was returning. She could stand for a few minutes at a time, her movements slow but deliberate, the proud poise of someone who'd learned never to show weakness. Her shawl hung damp from the heater, its sea silk threads catching light like faint emerald fire. She was alive again, but her eyes sharp, assessing, never softened. Trust came slowly to people who'd been betrayed by systems meant to save them. Lee, however, had no such walls. She followed Ethan everywhere, asking about his medkit, his old field patches, his scars. He answered most of her questions with patient humor, though each one cut a little closer to the quiet guilt he carried. She reminded him of children he'd lost on the battlefield, tiny lives snuffed out because supplies arrived too late. Now, as she sat drawing shapes in the condensation on the wall, humming some haunting Rennie lullaby, Ethan felt the ache of something long dormant, the need to protect. Outside, the city shifted in subtle, dangerous ways. He'd heard it through vent chatter and overheard transmissions on the clinic frequency. A report had gone out the previous day, a human male interfering with a theft at an upper-tier pharmacy. Suspect aided unregistered hybrids. Security sweeps were expanding through the lower levels, scanning heat signatures for anomalies. He knew it wouldn't be long before someone traced the flagged energy output from the heater. You're thinking too loudly, Mary said from her corner, her voice soft but certain. She was sitting upright now, combing her damp hair with her fingers. I can tell when a man's planning to run. Ethan looked over, caught her gaze, and didn't deny it. If I stay, you're all at risk. The sweep will catch our coil pattern eventually. Then we move, she said simply. The market vents stay warm during cycle shifts. We can hide there until the scanners pass. It's open ground, he countered. You'd freeze before you found shelter. We've done worse, she said. Her tone wasn't defiant, just factual, like a woman too used to surviving on borrowed air. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, watching the steam from the heater rise like smoke. "You said your husband worked maintenance?" "He did," she replied. "Before they decided marrying a human disqualified him from service." There was bitterness beneath her calm, a quiet fury smoothed over by exhaustion. "He built half these lower corridors. He knew where the power lines ran, how to hide heat without tripping the sensors." Ethan studied her, admiration and sadness twisting together in his chest. "You married a smart man." "I buried one," she said flatly. The silence that followed was a wound they both pretended not to see. Lee looked up between them, sensing tension she couldn't name. "Are we leaving again?" she asked. Mary started to answer, but Ethan's wrist-com blinked softly. A local signal intercept. Clinic band encrypted. He checked the code, pulse quickening. Security drones were 2 sectors away, sweeping for illegal residencies. He glanced at the heater monitor. "We can't move yet," he muttered. "They'll be right outside the vents." "Then what?" Mary asked. "We wait." He powered down the coil to minimal output, plunging the room into half-dark. The only light came from the faint glow of the rain-filtering vents, turning Mary's skin to glassy sapphire and Les' hair to threads of silver. They huddled close, the silence filled with distant mechanical hums. Above them, the city thrummed like a living thing, perfect, indifferent, and cruel. Ethan felt the weight of every breath they took, each one a defiance against a world that had decided who deserved to breathe. He tightened his grip on his medkit and whispered more to himself than to them. "We'll survive the night. After that, we move." Mary met his eyes through the dimness, something fierce and fragile sparking between them, a recognition of 2 souls, too stubborn to die quietly. And as the sound of distant drones echoed through the corridors, Ethan Cade realized that somewhere, between saving and staying, he had chosen both, and there was no turning back. The night bled into chaos before dawn could bring its calm. Ethan Cade woke to the faint whine of a security drone, threading through the vent corridors above them, its red scanner light bleeding through the cracks of the bulkhead like a pulse of danger. The heater was dead silent now, powered down to avoid detection, leaving the air cold enough that each breath came out as a ghost of vapor. Mary sat upright instantly, every muscle in her tense, her hand instinctively moving to shield Lie, who stirred against her side. Ethan motioned for silence, rising to his feet, boots barely whispering against the floor. Through the wall, he could hear the metallic rhythm of enforcer boots, 3 of them, maybe 4, methodical, sweeping in formation. His mind flashed through possibilities: escape through the maintenance shaft, too noisy. Vent crawl, too narrow. Bluff, maybe, but risked exposure. The thrum of the drones grew louder, punctuated by the chirp of command tones. Unit 12, anomaly detected. Heat irregularity within maintenance 12C. Mary's eyes flicked toward him in silent question. Ethan's jaw clenched. He knelt by the heater coil, rerouting its power line into his field kit. The device hummed softly, then projected a faint holographic reading across his wristpad. He entered a string of old military override codes, fingers steady despite the tremor running through his pulse. The pad blinked once, twice, then accepted the command. The heater's last burst of residual energy flushed through the walls, creating a phantom heat signature 50 meters down the corridor. Seconds later, the sound of boots shifted, false positive moving toward next sector. He exhaled, slow and quiet. But before relief could settle, a new sound cut through the tension, the crack of a secondary scanner piercing the air. A smaller drone, independent, slipped past the main patrol and hovered at the entrance of the alcove, its blue lens sweeping through the gloom. Lee gasped softly, and Mary pressed a hand over her mouth, her heartbeat audible in the silence. Ethan moved fast, grabbing his medkit and flicking a compartment open. From it, he pulled a signal injector, an old field device meant to override neural sensors during combat triage. He stepped into the open, directly facing the drone's light. The red lens flared as it locked onto him. Identity request, unauthorized presence detected. Medical emergency response, he said evenly, lifting the injector. Code Theta 9. The drone hesitated, whirring in mechanical thought. Theta 9 is inactive protocol. Ethan gave a half smile, the kind soldiers used before lying through their teeth. Not when there's blood on the floor. He thumbed the injector, firing a short-range pulse that hit the drone's lens. The light flared, then sputtered out, sparks snapping in the air before it crashed to the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Mary was staring at him now, breathing hard, eyes wide. "You didn't say you were still military." He shook his head, already dismantling the drone for its power cell. "I'm not. Just someone who remembers how they think." He stuffed the remains into a supply bag and turned to her. "We have to go now. They'll trace the malfunction signal." She hesitated, looking down at her daughter. "She can walk," Ethan said firmly. "But we move quiet." Mary nodded, slipping her shawl over Lee's shoulders. Together they stepped into the corridor, their reflections faint against the rain-slick metal. The air was colder, sharper, the city above them pulsing with indifferent light. Ethan led the way through narrow tunnels, guided by memory and instinct, until they reached a vent shaft overlooking the lower market levels. The hum of generators and distant chatter echoed upward, a sound almost alive. Mary touched his arm, eyes unreadable. "You keep saving us, and one day there'll be no place left to hide." He met her gaze. "Then we stop hiding." Her lips parted as if to argue, but the words never came. Below them, the glow of the market spread out like a galaxy trapped beneath glass, a place of danger and possibility. Ethan glanced back once at the dark corridor they'd left behind and knew there was no going back. Not for them, not for him. The war he'd escaped had simply changed shape, and this time he wasn't fighting for a uniform or a flag. He was fighting for two lives that had become the only truth he still believed in. Dawn broke over Aerolus Spire in ripples of silver and gold, light filtering down through the rain-smeared glass of the upper tiers and scattering like liquid fire across the lower levels, where Ethan, Mary, and Lee moved through the awakening market. The air was alive with the hum of vending pods, the hiss of steam vents, and the distant chime of advertisements echoing from translucent billboards above. To anyone else, it was just another day in the city in the clouds, but to Ethan Cade, it was a miracle to be breathing freely after the night they'd survived. His shoulders ached, his clothes were damp from condensation, but for the first time in years, the tension between each heartbeat had eased into something almost like calm. They blended with the early crowd traders setting up stalls, workers in gray uniforms drinking cheap synth coffee before their shifts, a few children darting between stalls chasing flickering drone lights. Mary stayed close, her shawl drawn tight, the soft teal fabric hiding her face just enough to make her look like any tired worker. Lee clung to her mother's hand, her small fingers interlaced with stubborn determination, her eyes wide, with the kind of wonder only children could afford. Ethan guided them through the maze of kiosks, pausing at a small stand run by an elderly man who didn't ask questions. He bought 3 packs of jelly bread and a small heater coil, paying with the last of his legitimate credits. When the man handed over the coil, his gaze lingered on Ethan's military patch, half hidden beneath his sleeve. "Didn't think your kind came down here anymore," he murmured. Ethan wholly replied, "I go where people still bleed." The man gave a slow nod, understanding more than he said, and turned away. They found a corner near the outer window, where the city opened into a breathtaking view of the turquoise ocean far below. The sky was clearing, streaks of pink and amber stretching across the horizon like wounds healing. Lee pressed her palms to the glass, eyes wide. "It's so big," she whispered. Mary smiled faintly, brushing her daughter's hair. "It always was." Her voice carried something between awe and grief, the tone of someone who had forgotten what beauty looked like until now. Ethan stood beside them, sipping the last of his cold coffee, staring at the reflection of their three silhouettes, framed against the endless light. "You could stay hidden here for a while," he said quietly. "Plenty of work for someone who knows how to fix things. People pay for warmth." Mary turned toward him, the shawl slipping just enough to reveal the faint shimmer of her blue skin in the morning glow. "And you?" she asked. "Where would you go?" He looked down at his hands, scarred and steady. "I don't know. I stopped having a place a long time ago." She studied him, the hard edges of her face softening. "You could have one again." The words caught him off guard. Before he could answer, Lee tugged at his sleeve. "Are we safe now?" she asked. Ethan crouched down to her level, meeting her violet eyes. "For now, little one. But the kind of safe we make ourselves lasts longer than the kind they give us." She nodded solemnly, as if understanding more than she should. For a moment, the three of them stood together in silence, the hum of the market fading into the background, replaced by the distant rhythm of rain beginning again high above. Then, from his wristpad, a soft ping broke the calm, a message flashing across the cracked display. "Federation Medical Authority. Unauthorized. Use of military protocol detected. Coordinates logged for retrieval." Ethan's stomach turned cold. He stared at the screen for a heartbeat too long before pressing delete. The message vanished, but the truth didn't. He was officially an outlaw now, hunted not for what he'd done wrong, but for daring to do something right. He rose, sliding the pad back into his coat. Mary saw the change in his face. "They found you," she said quietly. He nodded once. "They'll come. But not today." She stepped closer, her fingers brushing his wrist, the touch grounding him. "Then we make today count." Outside, the first rays of real sunlight broke through the clouds, striking the spire and scattering into 1,000 shards of color. The city looked alive for the first time. Ethan exhaled, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, belonging, fragile, but real. As Mary took Lai's hand, and they began to walk toward the lower corridors, he followed a step behind, no longer as their savior, but as someone who finally had a reason to stay. The war he'd been running from was over. The one worth fighting had just begun.